Washington, D.C. The spring of 1974. A Wednesday afternoon in a commercial boxing gym on the south side of Capitol Hill, 3 blocks from the Navy Yard. The gym had been there since 1951. It had low ceilings, a single regulation ring in the center, 4 heavy bags along the east wall, a speed bag station that had been repaired so many times the bracket no longer matched the original hardware, and the specific smell of old leather and rubber matting and the accumulated sweat of 23 years of men working hard in a small space. It was not a glamorous gym. It was the kind of gym that existed in every American city in that era, the kind that produced fighters nobody outside the sport had heard of and a few that everybody had. The owner was a man named Earl Bateman. He had been a middleweight contender in the late 1950s, had gone 12 rounds with 2 ranked fighters, had won 1 and lost 1, and had spent the subsequent 15 years teaching what he knew to men who came through his door and were willing to work. He ran a serious operation. The men who trained there were serious men. On this particular Wednesday, there were 11 of them working when the door opened at 2 in the afternoon. Joe Louis walked in alone. He was 30 years old. He was 6 feet tall and 195 pounds, and he carried himself with the economy of movement that belongs to men who have spent so long training their bodies that efficiency has become the default mode rather than the exception. He wore civilian clothes. Dark trousers, a plain gray long-sleeve shirt with the sleeves pushed up to the elbows, leather shoes that were not training shoes. He had not come to train. He had come because Earl Bateman had called him 3 days earlier and said there was a man at the gym who had been asking questions that Bateman thought Louis should hear in person. By 1974, Joe Louis was the most accomplished full-contact fighter in America. He had been the first man to win the heavyweight division of the Professional Karate Association. He had beaten every serious opponent the sport had produced. He had developed, over the previous decade, a fighting system that drew from karate, boxing, and kickboxing in a combination so practical and so difficult to categorize that the martial arts establishment had spent years arguing about where it belonged. Bruce Lee had called him the most dangerous man he had ever trained with. The people who had watched him fight did not argue with that assessment. The people who had not watched him fight sometimes did. The man who had been asking questions was standing near the heavy bags when Louis arrived. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 32 years old. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall and 228 pounds, a professional boxer with a record of 19 wins and 2 losses, 17 of those wins by knockout. He had spent the previous 8 years training at gyms in Philadelphia and New York and had arrived in Washington 4 months earlier to prepare for a fight that had since fallen through. He had been training at Bateman's gym while he waited for his manager to arrange the next one. He was a serious fighter by any professional boxing standard. He had power in both hands and a jab that boxing coaches in Philadelphia had been calling one of the best in his weight class for 5 years. He also had, in the 4 months he had been at Bateman's gym, developed a specific opinion about karate fighters that he had been sharing with anyone in the gym who would listen. The opinion was this: that karate was a sport for men who wanted to look like fighters without accepting the consequences that real fighting produced. That the rules that governed karate competition, the point system, the controlled contact, the judges scoring performance rather than damage, had produced a generation of athletes who moved well and hit nothing and called themselves martial artists. He said this with the authority of a man who had been hit hard by serious professionals and was still standing, which in his mind gave him the standing to make categorical statements about what hitting and being hit actually required. He was not entirely wrong. There were karate practitioners for whom his description was accurate. He was wrong in the specific way that men are wrong when they take a true observation about part of a thing and apply it to the whole thing without checking whether the whole thing contains exceptions that invalidate the generalization. He had been told that Joe Louis was coming in. He had not adjusted his opinion in response to this information. This was the first mistake. Earl Bateman made the introduction simply. He said the name and stepped back. The 11 men in the gym had stopped what they were doing when Lewis walked in, the way gyms stop when someone walks through the door who has a specific kind of presence, the kind that arrives before the person does and does not announce itself but is simply there when the person is there. They were watching the introduction with the careful attention of men who understood what was about to happen and had decided that whatever it was, they wanted to see it clearly. Marcus Webb looked at Joe Louis. He extended his hand. Louis took it and shook it once. Webb said he had heard a lot about Lewis's record in karate tournaments. He said it in the tone he always used when he said the word tournaments. Not hostile. Something more precise than hostile. The tone of a man who has decided that a particular word contains within it an entire argument, and that saying the word in a particular way is equivalent to making the argument. Lewis said nothing. He looked at Webb the way he looked at things he was reading, which was completely, without any portion of his attention withheld for something else. There was no shift in his expression. No tightening around the eyes that would signal offense taken or argument forming. He simply looked at Webb the way you look at a problem you have already solved and are now watching someone else describe from the outside. He had heard versions of this argument before. Not here, not from Webb specifically, but from men in gyms in other cities who had looked at his record in karate competition and made a judgment about what that record meant about his ability to generate real force. The judgment was understandable. It was based on incomplete information. Lewis had never felt the need to correct it with words when the alternative was to correct it with his hands. Webb kept going. He had an audience and he had been making this argument for 4 months and he was comfortable with it. He said that karate men learned to pull their punches so early in their training that they never developed the mechanical understanding of what a punch that lands with full force actually requires from the body producing it. He said that the hip rotation, the weight transfer, the shoulder drive that a real punch needs comes from years of hitting things that push back, heavy bags, mitts held by partners who are trying to absorb real force, other men in rings. He said that a man who had spent his career stopping his punches 2 inches from a target had built into his nervous system a habit of deceleration that he could not remove simply by deciding to remove it in a real situation. He said this with the confidence of a man who had thought about it seriously and believed he was correct. He had been making this argument at Bateman's gym for 4 months. He had made it to the welterweights who trained on Tuesday mornings. He had made it to the 2 amateur light heavyweights who came in on Thursday evenings. He had made it to Earl Bateman himself, who had listened without agreeing or disagreeing, which Webb had taken as a form of agreement. He had made it with the specific repetition of a man who has found an argument that feels true and has not yet encountered the evidence that would complicate it. The argument was coherent. It was delivered with conviction. It was built on real observations about real practitioners. And it had, in 4 months of repetition, calcified from an observation into a belief, and from a belief into the kind of certainty that a man carries when he has not yet been asked to test it against the specific case it was designed to describe. He was describing a real problem. The problem existed. There were karate practitioners who had exactly the habit he was describing. What he did not know, and what he was about to find out, was that Joe Louis had identified the same problem himself 10 years earlier and had spent the decade since then specifically solving it. Louis listened to all of it. When Webb finished, Louis nodded once. Then he said that Webb was describing something real. He said it in the flat, informational tone of a man who does not argue about things he can demonstrate. He said that he would be happy to show Webb what he meant, if Webb was willing to put the gloves on and work the mitts for a few minutes. Not a sparring session. Not a fight. Mitt work. The most basic and verifiable test of whether a man can generate real punching power from a karate base. Webb said yes. He said it the way a man says yes when he believes the demonstration is going to prove his point for him. Earl Bateman brought out the focus mitts. Webb put them on. He had held mitts for serious punchers for 8 years. He knew what real power felt like when it arrived through the leather pads into his palms and up through his shoulders. He knew the difference between a punch that looked fast and a punch that transferred force. He took his position, mitts up, and waited. Lewis stood in front of him. He did not put boxing gloves on. He wrapped his hands with hand wraps and left them bare over the wrapping, the way a man does when he wants the contact to be unambiguous rather than padded. He took a stance that was not a boxing stance and not a karate stance but something that contained elements of both, weight distributed slightly differently than a boxer would distribute it, lid foot angled slightly outward, hands held at a height that was neither orthodox boxing guard nor the high open hand guard of tournament karate. The stance of a man who had spent 10 years taking the useful parts from every system he had studied and discarding the parts that did not hold up under real conditions. The 11 men in the gym had arranged themselves in the specific formation that men arrange themselves in when they want to see something clearly and do not want to miss any of it. The heavy bags hung still. The speed bag was silent. The gym was quiet in the way that gyms go quiet when the floor drops away from what was expected to happen and something else arrives in its place. Lewis threw the first combination. A jab to the right mitt followed by a cross to the left. 2 punches. The jab arrived with the speed of a man who had been throwing it since he was 19 years old, and the cross arrived with the weight transfer and hip rotation that Webb had just finished explaining that karate men were incapable of producing. The sound the cross made when it landed on the left mitt was not the sound Webb had been expecting. It was the sound a punch makes when the body behind it is organized correctly from the ground up, when the push from the back foot travels through the hip and the shoulder and arrives at the fist having lost nothing along the way. Webb took a half step back. Not because he chose to. Because the force required it. He reset. His face had changed. Not dramatically. The change was small and specific, the change in a man's face when a piece of information has just arrived that is inconsistent with the model he has been operating from. He was a professional. He had absorbed harder shots than that in training rings in Philadelphia. But he had absorbed them from men he had expected to hit him that hard, which is a different thing from absorbing them from a man he had spent 4 months explaining could not hit him that hard. Lewis threw again. This time a jab, a cross and a left hook to the body mitt that Webb had dropped to hip level. The hook was the punch that the men standing around the gym remembered afterward. It was thrown from the karate base, from the angled stance with the weight loaded onto the back hip, and it arrived at the body mitt with the torque of a man who had spent 10 years learning to generate rotational force from a position that boxing coaches did not teach because they had never been asked to. The sound it made was different from the cross. Lower. More compact. The sound of force concentrated into a very small area delivered very quickly. Webb dropped the mitt. Not because he decided to. Because his arm absorbed what arrived and made a decision his brain had not yet caught up to. He stood for a moment with the mitt at his side. The gym was completely silent. Lewis stood where he had been standing. He was breathing normally. He was not performing anything. He was simply there, in the same stance, with his hands in the same position, waiting to continue if Webb wanted to continue. Webb looked at Lewis for a long time. The look of a man running a rapid and honest recalculation. He was not a foolish man. He was a serious professional who had made a serious error, which was to generalize from examples he had seen to a conclusion about a man he had not yet tested. The error was understandable. The error was the kind that intelligent people make when they have enough evidence to feel confident and not quite enough to be right. He set both mitts down on the ring apron behind him. He looked at Lewis. He said that he owed Lewis a different conversation than the one he had been having. He said it directly, the way serious men say things they mean. He said that what he had felt through the mitts was not what he had described that morning or any of the mornings before it. He said that he had been wrong about what he said. Lewis nodded once. He said that the problem Webb had described was real. He said that it existed in some karate practitioners the way Webb had described it. He said that the solution was to hit things that pushed back, which was what he had spent the previous 10 years doing. The 11 men in the gym went back to work. The heavy bags began moving again. The speed bag resumed its rhythm. Earl Bateman picked up the mitts from the ring apron and hung them on the hook where they lived between sessions. The afternoon continued in the way that serious gym afternoons continue, with the specific focused energy of men who have just watched something that reminded them why they are there and what the work is actually for. Marcus Webb trained at Bateman's gym for another 6 weeks before his next fight was arranged. He did not repeat the argument he had been making for 4 months. He was not a man who needed to be told twice. Joe Louis did not speak about that Wednesday afternoon for many years. He was not a man who collected moments of being right. He was a man who went to gyms and worked and let the work say what it needed to say. The men who were in Bateman's gym that afternoon said it for him, in the way that witnesses always say the things that the principals never bother to say themselves, because the principals were there and know what happened and do not need to explain it. The witnesses were also there. They also know what happened. The difference is that they still feel the need to tell it, because what they saw that Wednesday afternoon was something that is easy to forget when you have spent a long time inside a single art and have stopped asking whether the thing you believe about fighting has ever been tested against a man who did not agree to cooperate with the test. The answer to that question, in Joe Louis's case, was always the same. It had been the same since he was 19 years old. It was still the same on that Wednesday afternoon in Washington. It would remain the same until the last day he trained.